Welcome. My name is Richard Capone. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Let's Go Learn, and welcome to our webinar, Moving from Paper to Performance Implementation. And as you know, behavior is a hot topic, and so we're real excited to be hosting this webinar because at Let's Go Learn, we've always been focused on the academic side. We've been focused on reading and math assessment and instruction. And so today, having this behavior assessment is great because it sort of balances out the full side, both sides of the triangle of MTSS. And we're so lucky to have our two speakers, Amy Dupree and Amy Adams. Their experience is quite extensive. Amy was most recently a special ed director or EC director, and Amy Adams was a behavior district coordinator. So between the two of them, they have so much practical experience, which makes for a really, really good webinar because they'll be able to tell you the ins and outs of what works, what doesn't. And so we're real excited to have them here speaking with you all today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to both of you, Amy and Amy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. And thank you for everyone for joining us this morning. We're glad to be here for our second installment of discussing behavior within the MTSS framework. Yesterday, we shared the most foundational elements for beginning how to consider creating a behavior framework in your school. And today, we're going to expand on that idea and discuss ways to help you move your systems from that paper implementation or a checklist implementation to an actual actionable process. One of the things we discussed yesterday was our behavior framework. And just as a quick review, each section of the behavior triangle has those actionable verbs: determine, teach, implement, engage, decide, consider, and review. And we share this triangle because it breaks down each component into those action steps for you for implementation. And if you have those action steps working in concert, they're going to create systems that mirror that of the academic side of the triangle. And this is a part that we feel is really important to have staff understand, is that the academic MTSS triangle and the behavior MTSS triangle truly have the same functions. So the core side of the behavior triangle is for core behavior instruction. Tier 2 and Tier 3 in the behavior triangle is for supplemental interventions and intensive interventions. And when you have all of those together, you're getting data, and that data becomes, again, actionable. And that's what we're trying to help you guys move to today. So the behavior side, we really want to be viewed just as the academic side is. And often that just isn't the case. So we want to start by sharing a little bit of perceptual data. When teachers were asked, do you feel supported in managing disruptive behaviors in your buildings, out of a scale from 1 to 10, only 5.5 was the average score, which is really pretty low. Because if you think about 80% being core and fidelity implementation in a building, and the 80% of your students are being reached with core, it really should be at least 8 out of 10 that your staff is feeling supported when managing disruptive behaviors. But when it comes down to it, the reality is really district leadership, school administrators, teachers, and parents, everyone is truly doing their best to support and manage disruptive behaviors. And most districts and most schools have some type of system that they're trying to use to address behavior in the buildings. But those systems are not necessarily tiered to support intervention. And more importantly, they're probably just a paper implementation. So as a district leader or a school leader, you probably feel like you're supporting staff managing their behavior, but data would suggest that teachers feel minimally supported. And at the end of the day, we all know that feelings are perceptions, and those perceptions then become people's realities. So some additional perceptual data points. Your leadership in your school or district may have determined that there's a protocol for managing behavior disruptions, but there's probably, again, a disconnect among the educators about what's in place in schools. So almost every person who was surveyed in the district, as far as an administrator, indicated that behavior protocols existed. but only half of the school administrators believed that to be operationalized and effective. And the same disconnect then trickled down to the school level. So people believe they have things in place, but those who have to then implement or rely on those protocols don't feel like they're effective. So again, it comes back to how actionable and how operationalized and functional are these systems. The Education Advisory Board conducted surveys of 41 districts, and these districts ranged in population from 2,000 to 50,000 students of very diverse backgrounds and settings. And while all of the districts reported implementing PBIS, only 57% of their teachers reported using PBIS practices frequently in their work. And given that the success of PBIS as a predictor of consistency, and that's a huge disconnect of effectiveness. And that was kind of the similar data point when they asked if you had a dedicated SEL curriculum. They were given one, but only 25% of staff were using that with any type of fidelity. So when you think about then those data points, we have to go back to our triangle and think about what's going on. And it really boils down to there being a breakdown of structures and practices within these tiers. So not all the parts are then operating at a level that would indicate a fidelity of practice. And what typically happens then is that you have schools that have rules in place or a PBIS matrix, a list of expectations, or even a code of conduct. And the students who are following it are operating and functioning well at the core level. And that's where core stops because they've presented the list or the matrix, and that's the expectation, and those kids are doing well. And then what then in turn happens is that you have teachers and administrators busy handling all of the behaviors that become those big fires at the tier 3 level in school. And then that means that you've got a gap in all of the other systems that support core and tier 2. And so when you have that type of system, that equates to a lot of the perceptual data that we just shared.
So many districts end up stuck in the paper implementation phase, where new policies and procedures are put into place, but there is a decoupling of operational routines from formally adopted programs, and that can lead to disproportionality. In order to successfully achieve performance implementation, where innovative practice is put into place and moves from that accepted practice to a new definition in your building of teaching as usual, you must operationalize your behavior framework. Operationalization means turning abstract concepts into measurable observations. So what does it mean to be respectful in your building? What does it mean to act aggressively? What does it mean for your teachers to provide positive feedback? You need to define those clearly in a topographic way so that there is a commonality of understanding with what each of those targets mean. Because when you operationalize, you increase reliability and you decrease bias. Not only should you operationalize the components of your core behavior practices, but you should operationalize the process of implementation in order to ensure successful adaptation and innovation. We're going to share Let's Go Learn's Operationalizing School Behavior Systems protocol with you, which is based on the most current implementation best practices. This OSBS protocol is a 5-step process to support performance implementation at your school. So step 1 is orientation, and that includes identifying your team, using that change agent that we talked about yesterday, who is an expert to help then orient your school about the process of OSBS. Next comes baseline data assessment, and that includes defining the types of assessments that you're going to use and what the protocol is for conducting those assessments. Then you want to do your baseline assessment. And next comes developing an action plan and securing commitment. Using the baseline data that you gleaned from your assessment, you're going to define areas of strength and need. You're going to prioritize targets for setting goals and identifying data sources so that you can progress monitor your achievement toward those goals. This step also includes securing a commitment with your staff to support that change, secure some buy-in. Step 4 is implementation and progress monitoring. So providing the necessary professional development, coaching, modeling, that positive behavior management for your staff, all while data is continuously being reviewed and your program is continuously being adjusted. Finally, we come to a quarterly assessment where you're going to repeat that baseline assessment you used, celebrate successes, and support further growth in your building. Research tells us that in order to successfully implement new practices, you must have an effective system for monitoring your implementation progress. Let's Go Learn uses a core behavior assessment tool that supports districts in measuring the effectiveness of a school's core behavioral practices across 10 domains that align with our triangle that we shared with you yesterday and at the beginning of today. So those are those action words we're looking for. You're going to determine, you're going to teach, and you're going to implement. Now, we believe that we have the best tool because of how concrete each indicator is. But there are a lot of tools out there, such as the FAMS or the FAMD or the TFI. The important thing is that you are using a tool to collect data on the effectiveness of your program and that you're using that data to adjust, amend, and just flat out change what you're doing based on what that data is telling you. Performance implementation requires a sustained effort in order to produce those desired results.
I think what's also important to mention about a core behavior assessment tool is when we think back to the data that we started our presentation with, that we shared, that is the disconnect, is that people think they're doing things, but when you have to get in and truly analyze, do we see these things happening? Are they implemented? Do we hear implementation? Do we see implementation? Can people verbalize that implementation? That's where the actual change really comes from in calibrating your entire staff, tightening up your systems and practices, and ensuring that you have fidelity of data. Because what's most important in the triangle is to move kids backwards from core because the interventions work. And those intervention processes and data collection opportunities have to be monitored, as well as just the implementation in general. So it is critical, I believe, as leaders, that we use a core behavior assessment tool to measure what we're doing. So if you do all of those things with a core behavior assessment tool, then you will get to the point of operationalization, and that truly creates buy-in. And buy-in ensures that students are treated consistently and fairly. So you don't have one person in your staff doing one thing and the rest of the staff doing something different. Everybody has to be on the same page. And that keeps fidelity of data intact if everybody is doing the same thing. It also helps clear communication because you're all speaking the same language. You use the same terms with your families and in and amongst yourself as colleagues, and then with your students. Everybody has the same exact understanding. And it also encourages the use of evidence-based practices. When someone isn't doing things that are evidence-based, it really provides flawed data, and you have to come back and do the reteaching and the recalibration with your staff who aren't using the evidence-based practices, because you won't have fidelity of data, and that will in turn give you incorrect information about your students. And lastly, if you have operationalization happening in your building, you've got really effective data collection and analysis. And when you do all of these things in concert, everyone succeeds. Your staff feels supported, your students feel like they're fairly treated, parents are on board because everybody is doing the same thing, and it just creates consistency. So when you think about operationalizing your MTSS behavior framework, you're really talking about a cycle. You're talking about practices. So you think about your core, and again, we shared this yesterday, and it's part of our triangle that will also be shared out with you, but you're determining, you're teaching, and you're implementing. And once you do those three things, you are creating engagement. Engagement creates data, and then data helps you evaluate what you're doing with making adjustments if you need to, or continuing to do the things that are successful. But adjustments are going to happen. You have a different cohort of students every year. You have often different cohort of staff members. And so adjustments have to be made based on that data. So it's critical that people learn to internalize data analysis so that it doesn't become personal. It becomes more of a way that we do business. And really, when you do these things and they're functioning well and you have fidelity of practice, that perceptual data reality that people have, it becomes really aligned to your intended purpose, because you don't want that type of data that we started with today. You don't want your perceptions of your staff to be unaligned with your intention. So having a system and a process to look at your MTSS behavior framework creates perceptual data, again, that aligns to your intended outcomes.
We're going to drop into the chat, and there's a QR code here for you today with a handout for operationalizing school behavior systems protocol. This will go a little bit further in depth than we talked about into what each of those steps are and what the component parts of each of those steps are, so that you can start to review the behavior framework that you're using in your schools and operationalizing those bits where you need to. I also hope that if you have further questions, or you are interested in learning how to in-depth operationalize behavior systems within that MTSS framework, that you will join us July 8th through the 10th in Nashville, Tennessee, where we're going to be putting on one of our conferences. We spend 3 days really diving deep into discrete data points and helping schools and districts learn to operationalize and revamp their response to behaviors inside their buildings. We have found from participants in the past that they really value coming as a school team, because we provide a lot of good time for people to be able to work together and begin to internalize these concepts and review their own practices in their buildings. And that can be done in an atmosphere where you have access to some change agent leaders like Amy and I to maybe help provide some helpful suggestions on where to start.
All right. I think we have some questions too, so I'm going to go ahead and read some of them. So here's the first one. We're concerned that implementing MTSS will take away from valuable instruction time. How can we ensure it's efficient and effective? And how do we sell this concept?
So MTSS is a framework, and the core portion of an MTSS framework for academics and behavior, it's instruction. It's how you do business in your building. So whatever curriculum you have for academics and whatever curriculum and behavior matrix you have for the behavior side, it's all instruction. It doesn't detract from instruction. It is your instruction. And if you're providing instruction and looking at data points, both academically and behaviorally, and you see that you have students who are not achieving, then you would intervene. And that's what tier 2 and tier 3 are. They're systems of intervention that you then pull your like groups of students or even individual students and provide intentional and research-based interventions to make sure that you're closing the gap. So even at tiers 2 and 3, that's also instruction. It's just intensive and tailored instruction.
And I'm going to put in that you will probably buy yourself back more time than you spend instructing with good student behavior. So when you're not having to pause instruction in order to address challenging behaviors in the classroom, when you're not having to spend minutes of the day waiting out disruptive behavior, you're getting that back on the other end to be able to be more compliant with the bell-to-bell instructional schedule.
And when we talk about behavior instruction, we're not saying carve out another period of 45 minutes a day. It really should become part of an internalized language that your staff uses when they're lining their students up to transition, when an administrator is doing morning announcements or afternoon announcements. Maybe you have morning meetings. We're not saying you have to carve out additional huge blocks of time for instruction. It also can become a way that maybe your guidance counselors participate or support and facilitate that instruction. So it takes some creative thinking based on how your individual school works with scheduling, but it should become part of a natural and internalized conversation.
All right, super. And that actually answered another question was, what are some specific strategies to boost buy-in? So I think that's really a good one. Here's another question. We collect lots of data on behavior, but translating it into best practices and actionable interventions is a challenge. Can you share some examples on how to close this gap?
Sure. Schools tend to do a really good job of collecting plethoras of data, but you have to make sure that it's relevant to the question you're asking. So are we getting more than just an incident count of a student's behavior? Are we able to get some data around when it's happening, some of the function of that behavior? What are the interventions we're using, and are we using them with fidelity and for a sustained enough period of time in order to be able to see behavior change? On average, behavior change takes between 6 and 8 weeks in order to see. So if we only try something for a month, we didn't really give it enough time to be effective and work, and you're not truly using that evidence-based intervention with fidelity. So making sure that we're collecting data that's relevant to answering the questions we're looking to have answered is a really important start with that.
And that's a great example of looking at an individual student. When you're thinking about a system, another example of data that is collected is if you move students through a tiered system of support and decide by the time you're at tier 3 that if you have exhausted all of your interventions and you might need to move that student forward to consider eligibility into special education, if you do that process a lot, but you get to the special education eligibility meeting and the kid doesn't place or qualify because you don't have quality data, then that not only tells you that you've not provided the right intervention, as Amy gave the example for intervening with a student, but you also don't have a strong process in your building for how you have fidelity of interventions that are aligned to the student individually. So you have a lot of D&Q data that shows up, and that's a systemic issue in the building. So those are two different ways that you could approach using data to drive what you're doing.
Super. Also, as a reminder, enter in any questions you might have into the Q&A or the webinar chat. All right, here's the next question. What are some ways to celebrate successes and maintain momentum beyond the initial MTSS implementation?
Well, I believe that becomes how you create systems in your building. I know for me personally, as a principal, I really wanted behavior to be the thing that we looked at and celebrated equally alongside academics. So one of the strategies that I used was I turned AB honor roll celebrations over to my PTO, and I took over celebrations for behavior. And my school was the Jets, and so we had the Jet of the Month celebration, and we invited families to come and celebrate students who had been nominated by their peers to share in what great citizens they were in the building, because at the end of the day, we want our kiddos to be great citizens and great community members. And that was a focus for me. I didn't want to detract from the academics. We celebrated that, of course, but I really wanted us to have a positive culture and climate in the building so that students could do the learning and could do the work that they were there to do and celebrate them each and every month. And one of the things that we will share at our conference are additional strategies that across multiple schools that we've worked with, and probably be able to help you tailor something specifically to what's happening in your building as far as creating celebration and positive momentum.
I will also say that we've had schools who have used a strategy that we share where they set an SEL target for staff. So maybe it's using proximity to manage behavior in your classroom. And then the OSBS team within their building kind of PBISs their staff. And they pass out tickets or recognition or entry to a lottery or Jeans Day passes as they see and hear these pieces being implemented in their building, so that there's some direct, immediate feedback and reward to the adults in the building, because everybody likes a cookie kids and adults.
All right, here's another question. Do these strategies work for students who are already in special education because of behaviors?
Mm. Yeah.
Yes, they do. They do work for students who are in special education for behaviors. Again, as Amy mentioned, behaviors is a little bit more difficult to change than the academic. It takes more time, it takes more intentional instruction and data collection. And it's really, as the student gets older, it becomes part of how you engage with them so that they learn to take ownership and build some intrinsic motivation for self-management. But it does take time, but yes, it does support those students as well.
So I'm going to say all students are core. Our special education students are in core and should receive those same supports, as well as our general education students. Those special education students who are in EC because of behavior, they're no different. They just need a little bit more intensive intervention and specially designed instruction in order to gain those skills that are necessary to provide positive pro-social behaviors in school. All behavior is learned, and they just have learned a maladaptive pattern for behaving in typical social situations. So they may require a little bit more direct instruction. They may require some more sustained effort, like Amy was saying, but all kids can move back through the tiers and are capable of growth.
Great. Here's another question. What are some resources available to support ongoing MTSS professional development for staff?
Well, you could come to the conference.
Are there third-party websites that are good? Are there things where people can grab resources?
You know, Intervention Central, PBIS.org would be good third-party sites that kind of break down behavior into a very specific, what's the behavior I'm seeing? What is the response? PBIS.org will even, it'll take you through the tiered response to those behaviors. So if I've got a student who is blurting out, and it's just a tier 1 issue, what does that look like? If it's a tier 2 issue, what does that intervention look like? And it'll kind of walk you through that. Intensiveintervention.org helps with understanding the pattern of practice for dealing with intensive intervention students, as the website implies. But you know, our conference is a great resource, and we do offer a diverse menu of professional development opportunities where we can come in and provide some targeted professional development based on the data that individual districts or schools have available.
And
I
I
think
would caution you to, if you went to Intervention Central and you found an intervention that seemed to match a particular situation, it's also important to have the system alongside the intervention that supports the data collection and the fidelity of the implementation, and that you're looking at it with the correct lens to make sure that the student's getting what they're needing and that it's actually appropriate and working. So the system is just as important as identifying the intervention.
All right, and you sort of answered this, but it says we can't make it to the conference, but we want to develop our plan further. Can you all coach us during our planning, act as a guide and facilitator?
Yes, our contact information will be shared. All you have to do is reach out to us and we'll get back with you and help walk through what you're walking through.
I'll say
It's one of our favorite things to do.
Yeah. Oftentimes how we end up supporting districts is doing some intensive professional development and then providing continuous virtual online support, either during their OSBS team meetings that might be meeting weekly, or during PLC groups, or like they said, teacher planning time. We have lots of ways to be able to support schools that way.
All right. So I think I don't see any other questions popping up, and I think we're right at our time, 8:31. Well, for me. Oh, yeah, here. I'll tell you what, there's one more question. I'll squeeze it in. It just popped up. The reason I asked the question about special education students, but I have extreme violence students where behavior coaches don't know what to do. So will this help too?
Yeah, that's hard. So it will help. Evidence-based intervention helps everybody. It's finding the right evidence-based intervention for that student. It's about identifying what the replacement behavior and skills are, what those trigger points are for that violent behavior. You know, trying to put in place antecedent interventions so that you can avoid triggering the behavior, and then having a solid plan in place to create safety for both the teachers, students, and staff who are working with that child who is struggling in that moment.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so on your screen, there's a QR code for the conference and a QR code if you want to find out more about Let's Go Learn and our solution. We want to thank all of you, and you will get an email tomorrow or the day after with the video, with the handouts, and with the slides. So thank you, Amy and Amy. You guys were awesome, as usual. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.